Chapter 1. The morning sun spilled gold across the fields, casting long, honey-warm ribbons of light over the land and warming the dew that clung to the tall grass. Each blade shimmered, as though dusted with fine glass. A rooster crowed from the coop behind the barn, its call sharp and familiar in the crisp air, while the hens shuffled and clucked softly, their feathers rustling like dry leaves. Mary Williamson stepped out, drawing the coolness of dawn into her lungs, a woven basket cradled in her arms, filled with warm speckled eggs that clicked gently against one another as she moved. The wood of the basket handle was smooth against her palm, worn by years of use, her boots pressed into the damp earth, the soil soft from the night's rain, leaving shallow prints that filled faintly with moisture. As she made her way around the bend toward the farmhouse, the smell of wet earth, hay, and distant wood smoke wrapped around her, grounding her in a morning that felt deceptively peaceful. The land was quiet, too quiet, some might say, but Mary had long grown accustomed to silence. It followed her everywhere now, shadowing each step she took across the farm, settling into the folds of her dress and the hollow spaces of her heart. What once had been nothing more than the soft stillness of early dawn had become her companion and her shield, a barrier against a world she no longer trusted. 6 years had passed since the day the world had ended for her. 6 years since she had stepped into their kitchen and found Jacob, Emily, and Benji. Her whole life, stolen in a moment so brutal, it had shattered her voice, her mind, her soul. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't run, she had simply sat, cradling her children in her arms, rocking them gently as if sleep might return them. Her father had found her the next day, still sitting in the same position, her dress soaked in blood, her eyes vacant. He gently carried her to his wagon, still stacked with the tools he was returning to Jacob, the pie her mother sent along for the children, forgotten on the seat next to where he sat. For months afterward, Mary did not speak, not because she refused to, but because words had become foreign things, brittle and hollow, unable to hold the weight of what she had seen. Silence settled over her like a second skin. At night, sleep eluded her. When it finally came, it brought no mercy. Her nightmares replayed the moment she stepped into the kitchen, the stillness, the blood, the impossible quiet, the rifle close to Jacob's outstretched hand, over and over, each time carving the memory deeper into her bones. Food turned to ash on her tongue. Even the dishes she once loved, the warm cornbread her mother baked on winter mornings, the sweet apples from the orchard, tasted of nothing. She forced each bite down as though swallowing grief itself, her stomach twisting until she took in only enough to stay upright. Her cheeks hollowed, her dresses hung loose around her shoulders. Her reflection became a stranger, pale, thin, and dim-eyed, as though some essential spark had slipped away with her children. Yet her parents never looked away from her sorrow. Day after day they coaxed her back to the world, with a patience that asked for nothing in return. Her mother brushed her hair each morning, gentle strokes meant to anchor her to the present. Her father sat beside her at night, saying nothing, keeping vigil, as she trembled through the memories. Bit by bit, a sip of broth, a moment of rest, a breath that didn't burn. They nursed her back to life. At least, to life and body. Her spirit, they knew, would take far longer. The memory lived in her bones now, shaping the way she carried herself, the way her shoulders tightened at sudden sounds, the way she avoided the town, the church, and the neighbors whose whispers still clung to closed doors. She hadn't left her parents' farm in years, as though the fences themselves had become a kind of refuge, or a cage. Yet, even wrapped in silence, she could not escape the feeling that the world beyond the farm continued to move without her. The seasons changed, the cattle calved, the fields rose and fell with harvest and frost, all while she remained suspended in the same unbroken grief, held in place by memory as firmly as the fences that ringed the property. Sometimes, When the wind carried the faint hum of wagon wheels from the distant road, she felt a pull, a reminder that life still existed out there, waiting, watching, unchanged by her sorrow. It was in one of those moments, when the world beyond briefly brushed against hers, that she lifted her gaze. She squinted toward the ridge, the sun rising just above it, casting long shadows across the land. A figure emerged, tall, mounted, moving steadily toward her, her breath caught. Visitors were rare. Her parents had long since stopped trying to coax her into town, and no one came to the farm uninvited. Mary raised a hand to shield her eyes, the basket tilting slightly. The rider drew closer, the horse's hooves thudding against the dry earth. Dust rose in soft clouds around them. The man sat tall in the saddle, his coat dark, his hat low over his brow. Then she saw his face. Her blood turned to ice. Jesse Henderson. The name set in her mind like a curse. To Mary, he was the vulture who had swooped in the moment Jacob could no longer hold the world together, the man who collected what grief had left behind. When Jacob's fight against the bank finally broke him, when the fear and shame had hollowed him out so completely that he ended his own life, the farm had slipped from their hands, and Jesse had become its new owner. He was an outsider, a man with no roots in the valley, no history in its soil, yet he had settled himself on land that had carried Jacob's family for generations. Mary hated him for that, for standing where Jacob once stood, for walking the fields her children had run through with sunburned cheeks and laughter in their voices. He lived in the house her husband's ancestors had built, board by board, the house that had held her baby's last breath. To Mary, he had no right to any of it. Not the land, not the house, not the memory soaked into its walls like old stains that would never wash out. She took a step back, the eggs forgotten, her fingers tightening around the basket's handle. Her heart pounded in her chest, loud and erratic. Jesse reined in his horse a few yards from where Mary stood, the morning light casting long shadows between them. His voice, when it came, was low and formal. Mrs. Williamson. The name struck her like a slap. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years, not like that, not with the weight of widowhood behind it. She didn't answer, her fingers tightened around the basket, the eggs trembling inside. Her breath came shallow, her heart thudding against the cage of her ribs. Jesse Henderson, the man who had bought the land Jacob had died for. 6 years ago, after Mary buried her family and her world shattered, it was Jesse Henderson, unknown, unrooted, who rode into town and placed a winning bid. A few days before Jacob walked into their kitchen with the rifle he would use one last time, he returned from town, his face ashen and pinched. Mary knew something was wrong, but Jacob would not be drawn, and she only found out the extent of his grief-soaked mind afterwards, when it was already too late. Jacob had left no note. He didn't need to. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. Losing it had broken something in him, and Jesse Henderson, with his money and his timing, had taken it. Mary had never forgiven Jesse Henderson. She saw him once only, standing at the edge of the funeral, but he did not approach her, only nodded with his eyes cast down. Though he lived just over the ridge now, on what had once been her home, she had made sure never to lay eyes on him again. She avoided the road, the markets, the church. She had built her silence like a wall. And now he was here. "I didn't mean to startle you," Jesse said, his voice cautious. I need to speak to your father." Mary's eyes narrowed. The sun glinted off the edge of his saddle, and for a moment she saw Jacob's ghost behind him, standing in the doorway of the old farmhouse, smiling as Benji chased chickens across the yard. She took a step back. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Jesse nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that. "I know, I'm sorry." But he didn't leave. Chapter 2. Jesse Henderson sat tall in the saddle, waiting. Mary's breath was shallow, her face flushed with heat, not from the sun, but from the storm rising inside her. From the porch, Ellen Bradley stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes lit up at the sight of the visitor, though she glanced quickly at Mary, careful not to let her smile linger too long. "Well, hello, Jessie," she said warmly. Jessie dismounted, his boots stirring dust as they hit the ground. He removed his hat with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Bradley," he said, "I came to see if Samuel's around. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with him." Ellen gestured toward the distant slope. "He's in the west field, checking on the cattle. You'll find him past the second gate, near the old oak." Jessie nodded, tipping his hat again. "Much obliged." He turned and led his horse toward the field, his figure growing smaller with each step. Mary watched him go, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning. The basket of eggs trembled in her hands. Without a word, she turned on her heel and strode into the house. The screen door slammed behind her. She dropped the basket on the kitchen table, eggs rolling and bumping against one another, and marched down the hallway to her room. The door closed firmly behind her. She stood in the center of the room, fists clenched, chest heaving. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. She wanted to scream, to break something, to undo the years that had led to this moment. A soft knock came at the door. "Mary?" Ellen's voice was gentle, cautious. Mary didn't answer. The door creaked open, and Ellen stepped inside, her hands folded in front of her. She looked at her daughter with quiet sorrow. "I know what you're feeling," she said. "I know it still hurts." Mary turned away, her voice sharp. "He stole everything." Ellen stepped closer. "He bought the land, Mary. He didn't take Jacob's hand. He didn't pull the trigger." Mary's shoulders stiffened. "I was there," Ellen continued. "I saw what grief did to your husband, what fear did. But Jesse didn't cause it. He didn't know what that land meant to Jacob. He was just a man trying to start a life." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "He stays on our land," she whispered, "where my babies died." Ellen reached out, placing a hand on Mary's arm. "Yes, but you're still here, and you're still living. That matters." Mary pulled away, her voice trembling. "I don't want him here." Ellen nodded slowly. "I understand, but sometimes the past comes back, not to haunt us, but to ask for something, maybe even to offer something new." Mary turned her face to the window, watching the distant figure of Jessie disappear into the field. She didn't speak again, and eventually her mother left, softly closing the door behind her. The quiet settled around Mary like dust disturbed, then left to drift, but it did nothing to steady her thoughts. Now that she was alone, her mind circled back to what she had seen on the porch. The ease between her mother and Jesse Henderson, the quiet familiarity in their voices, the way he had stood there as though he belonged on this land. The realization unsettled her. How well did her parents know him? How often had he come by while she hid in her grief, too hollow to notice the world moving around her? Her mother had greeted him with the warmth reserved for someone trusted, someone known. And Jesse, he had looked entirely at home, his posture at ease, his voice steady, as though the farm was not home to Mary's grief, but simply another place he had learned to wait and watch. A slow ache gathered in her chest. Had they spoken with him often, drunk coffee together at the worn kitchen table? Did her father walk the fields with him, pointing out the lay of the land that once belonged to Jacob? The thought tasted like betrayal. Unfair, she knew, but heavy all the same. Chapter 3. The sun had climbed higher by the time Jessie reached the west field. The grass was dry and yellowing in patches, and the cattle moved slowly under the heat, flicking their tails at flies. Samuel Bradley stood near the fence line, inspecting a calf's leg, his weathered hands steady and sure. Jessie approached quietly, not wanting to startle the older man. Samuel looked up, squinting against the light, and gave a nod of recognition. "Morning, Jessie," he said pleasantly, brushing dust from his trousers. "Morning, Samuel," Jessie replied. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Just checking on this little one. Got a limp, but nothing serious. Jessie glanced at the herd, then back at Samuel. I come bringing news. Not good, I'm afraid. Ran into Pete McPherson yesterday. He lost 3 head of cattle. Said the wrestlers are getting bold. Not just taking strays anymore. Cutting fences, coming close to the homesteads. Samuel's brow furrowed. Pete? That's just over the ridge. Jessie nodded. Too close for comfort. I don't keep cattle myself, but I figured I'd offer to help. Night watch, maybe. I've got time, and I know how to shoot straight. Samuel looked at him. Grateful, but hesitant. That's mighty kind of you, Jessie. I appreciate it. Jessie studied his face. You're worried about Mary. Samuel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She's fragile. She hasn't laid eyes on you in 6 years, and I reckon she'd prefer it stayed that way. Jessie nodded slowly. Then I'll come after dark. No need to stir things up. I'll keep to the edge of the field, stay out of sight. Samuel's shoulders relaxed. That'd be best. Thank you. There was a pause, the wind rustling through the grass. Samuel looked out over the herd, then back at Jessie. You've been a good neighbor, Jessie. I want you to know that. None of us blame you for what happened. Jessie's jaw tightened. Mary does. She's grieving, Samuel said gently. Still, and maybe always will. But what came to pass? It was a tragedy. Losing our grandchildren like that. There's no words for it. He hesitated, then added. But Jacob, he wasn't the farmer his father was. Took risks, gambled on bad seasons. Mary won't hear it, but you buying the land wasn't the cause. It was the consequence. Jessie looked down. His voice quiet. I never meant to take anything from anyone. Especially not Mary's children. I know, Samuel said. You were just trying to build a life, same as the rest of us. They stood in silence for a moment, the cattle lowing softly in the distance. I'll see you tonight then, Jessie said, tipping his hat. Samuel nodded. We'll keep the lantern lit. As Jessie walked away across the pasture, the morning sun stretched his shadow long across the grass. Samuel watched him go, shoulders heavy with the weight of truths he wished his daughter never had to carry. The evening breeze picked up, stirring the dust and bending the tall grass, and for a moment the valley felt suspended, caught between the remnants of an old tragedy and the quiet tread of something new approaching. By the time Samuel returned to the farmhouse, dusk had settled like a thin veil over the yard. The lanterns glowed softly through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light onto the darkening porch. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. Mary moved through the rooms like a shadow, her thoughts troubled, her heart pulled in directions she did not yet understand. And as the last light sank behind the ridge, the night around the farm deepened, thick with memory and tension, carrying them all, gently, inevitably, into what the darkness would bring next. After her parents retired to their room, Mary remained restless. Sleep felt impossibly distant, hovering just out of reach like a memory she could no longer grasp. She moved quietly through the dark hallway, her bare feet whispering against the worn floorboards as she padded into the kitchen. She coaxed the coals in the potbelly stove back to life, nudging them gently until they glowed a deep cherry red. The faint warmth that rose from them was comforting, familiar. She filled up the kettle and set it atop the iron grate, listening to the soft hiss as the metal adjusted to the heat. Now she sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold. The lantern on the counter burned low, casting a small, trembling halo of light that barely reached the far corners of the room. The silence of the house was familiar. She had lived inside it for most of her life, except for the brief period when she had Jacob, a family. But tonight it felt different, thick, charged, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. She had heard her father mention Jessie's offer earlier that evening. He hadn't said much, just that Jessie would be helping with the night watch, keeping an eye on the cattle, that he'd be arriving after dark, that he'd stay out of sight, so as not to trouble her. Mary hadn't responded. She had simply nodded, her face carefully arranged into its usual unreadable stillness. But inside, something had shifted, subtle as a tremor beneath the earth, enough to unsettle her in ways she didn't yet want to name. Outside, the wind stirred against the eaves, carrying with it the faint creak of the barn doors and the distant, uneasy low of cattle. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Jessie Henderson was already crossing into their night, and Mary felt it. But now, as the shadows deepened and the wind picked up across the fields, she felt it, his presence. She couldn't see him from the window, but she knew he was out there, somewhere beyond the barn, near the fence line, watching, guarding. Her stomach twisted. She stood and walked to the back door, opening it just enough to let the night air in. The scent of hay and earth drifted in, mingling with the faint creak of the barn and the distant lowing of cattle. She scanned the darkness, her eyes adjusting slowly. Nothing moved, no lantern, no silhouette. But she knew. Jessie Henderson was out there. Her fingers curled around the doorframe. The man she had spent 6 years avoiding was now protecting her father's land, getting fat off the land her children had once played on, the land Jacob had died for, the land she had buried her heart in. How she hated him. It felt like betrayal, like intrusion. And yet, it also felt like something else, a gesture she didn't know how to name. She closed the door gently and returned to her room. But sleep did not come easily. She laid awake, listening for sounds in the night, hoofbeats, footsteps, anything. Her mind wandered to Jacob, to the way he had smiled when he spoke of legacy, of soil, of roots. And then to Jessie Henderson, the man who had claimed the wreckage with his 30 pieces of silver. Mary didn't cry. She hadn't in years. But her heart ached in a way it hadn't in a long time.